I hope everyone enjoyed the gala last evening. It really was a nice place. Food was good, fellowship was good, drinks were good, everything was good. Well, we've come to the final morning of NASBA's annual meeting. This morning, we're going to hear three brief reports from three of NASBA's very active groups: the Standard Setting Study Group, the Leadership Development Group, and the Legislative and Governmental Affairs Committee. Then, after we've heard from all three of them, we'll have time for questions. All these groups will be continuing their work throughout the year. First, we'll hear from Sam Cotterell. Last year, a new group formed and was led by Carlos Johnson called the Leadership Development Group. It was formed recognizing the need and importance of identifying and developing individuals for future leadership positions, both within NASBA and external appointments. The group was charged with making recommendations to the chair as to how best to identify, recruit, develop, and promote a diverse pool of men and women for these important appointments. The Leadership Development Group is composed of individuals who are recognized as leaders in the accounting profession. I now call on one of the group's members, NASBA's past chair, Sam Cotterell, to tell us about their work. Sam?
Thank you very much, Walter. It's a privilege to be the first person to be introduced by our new chair. Thanks, Walter. I thought it appropriate, since the topic today is leadership, that I share with you a not widely publicized in our schools and things, but probably one of the most important examples of leadership that's ever happened in our nation, and very appropriate for our location here. The year was 1790. George Washington was in his first year. He was in our nation's temporary capital in New York City. This was a wilderness. There wasn't anything here except Mount Vernon and other similar plantations in the area. Our Secretary of the Treasury was Alexander Hamilton, a brilliant but somewhat erratic individual. We just finished the Revolutionary War. Each of the states had a great amount of debt, not unlike today. And in fact, if you look at the percentage of debt and GDP and those sorts of things, the amount of debt that they had was somewhat similar to what we might have today. Hamilton had a brilliant approach to that. He was going to have the federal government assume that debt. And the reason he wanted to do that is because each of the individual states owed that debt mostly to foreign countries for financing the war. And if each of the states were negotiating with the foreign entities, then that would undermine the power of the federal government. And you remember that the great fight that had been fought after the Revolutionary War, the political fight, was what form our government was going to take. We'd settled on the Constitution. We'd had compromises between a strong federal government and a states' rights government. This debt almost undermined our ability at the very beginnings of our nation to have the type of government that we have today. So we have on one hand the Federalists, led by Washington and Adams and Hamilton. We have the states' rights folks, led by Madison and Jefferson. This assumption of debt was about to put asunder the Union even before we started. In fact, it was a crisis almost as big as the Civil War. And we know what happened at the Civil War. The Southern nations, led by Virginia, in 1790, were talking about seceding from the new nation. Well, with that backdrop, Thomas Jefferson, who had recently returned from France after 5 years there as our ambassador and minister there, and a little bit removed by that time from Virginia politics, called together Madison and Hamilton at a dinner in New York City. There, they worked out a compromise. This compromise went something like this. The debt could be assumed by the national government. For Virginia, whose portion of the debt was about $3 million, and they were going to be taxed $5 million to pay for that $3 million. So those of you from Virginia, you can understand why your governor, Patrick Henry, might have been making the same sorts of noises he was making before during the Revolutionary War when he said, "Give me liberty or give me death." He thought that those imperial northernists, the Federalists, were trying to hijack his country. Well, the Federalists thought that it was very important to have this stronger federal government, and the assumption of the debt was important. The compromise that was reached. The debt would be assumed, but our nation's capital, which was very much up in the air, whether it was going to be in New York, as many people wanted it, and it temporarily and currently was, whether it would be in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania area where the Congressional Congress had been, and where it was ultimately relocated to as a temporary place before Washington, D.C. was built, or the Potomac option, which was known as this area. At that time, the Potomac option was number 3. As part of the compromise, it was decided that Washington, D.C. would be located here, but they also needed to have a strong person that could make some decisions about what it would look like, how it would be laid out, all of those sorts of things. They didn't want to leave that up to Congress, as you can imagine why, kind of the same issues we have now. So they built into this compromise that it would be via executive order, and the only executive, the only person in the United States strong enough to deal with that was George Washington. So the Potomac solution, debt was assumed. Virginia's taxes, the accountants came into play here. We had a role in this. We redid the numbers. We magically determined that Virginia's debt was $3 million and Virginia's tax would be $3 million. And we put the capital in Washington, D.C. Well, how about the poor folks in Philadelphia? What did they get out of the deal? What they got out of the deal was Pennsylvania Avenue, where we're currently situated. So a great example of leadership where 3 leaders got together, worked out a compromise, and then had to go back to their various constituencies at some great political risk, particularly for Madison and Jefferson, to sell that compromise. So I found that story interesting. Thought it was a great example of leadership in the early years of our nation's capital. Well, leadership in NASBA. As you've heard, one of the visions that Carlos has is how can we improve leadership? He's constituted this committee. There are 3 things that we've focused on this year. 1, how do we get the best people serving on state boards of accountancy? We recognize that each state board, each state, has a different methodology. And we've all heard of situations where there's an incredibly qualified candidate that is nominated by whatever the process is, oftentimes by the state society, for your state board. And then for whatever reason, usually political, some lesser qualified person is put on the board. Now, I know that is not the case for anybody in this room today, but it does happen occasionally, okay? And so we recognize that we're not going to be able to change that. I mean, all things being what it is. But we do recognize that there may be instances where we can work with the societies, through our legislative work, as John's going to talk about, there are ways where we may be able to have some impact on that situation. So that's one of the things we're looking at. Admittedly, that's of lesser priority than the other two that I'm going to talk about, because we are pragmatic and realistic, and we do recognize that may not be able to have as much impact as we'd like. Number two, this is an incredible body. You are great, qualified individuals, the best and brightest of the CPA profession in your respective states. But what happens is you are busy people. You have your practice, your jobs, your families, your other community service opportunities, and you come to these NASBA meetings and you learn a lot, you go away energized, you think, you know, I really would like to get more involved with NASBA, and then reality of your world sets in. And you go back and you work on your board, you work on your job, and we, as NASBA, as an organization, lose out on the opportunity of having your great services in helping your other boards, your sister boards, through service to NASBA. And so one of the areas we want to focus on is improving how we identify you all and how you can make a greater contribution to NASBA with identification and training to help with that process. I remember when I first went to my first NASBA meeting in 1996, I thought, you know, great organization, didn't know much about it. You know, someday it might be kind of nice to become involved. And that was it, okay? One of the great benefits we have in NASBA is the committee approach that we have. One of the awfulest things in NASBA is the committee approach that we have. You know, we don't get as much done as we'd like to. But it's the committees where we get everything from the ground up, and we all get to participate on those committees. Well, we want to make sure that through our process we have the right people on the right committees, and that we're looking ahead and can identify you all that might have an interest and the skills to be future leaders in NASBA, and make sure we get you placed on the proper committees and the proper activities within NASBA. Now, we have a very good process for doing that now. We think we can make it better. We think we can enhance that. And so that's the second charge that this leadership group has, is to figure out how to identify and train future NASBA leaders that are already in this great organization of our state boards of accountancies. Third, we have a tremendous opportunity to have greater influence beyond our small NASBA group, and that's the broader organizations that we participate in. In the years that I've been involved with NASBA, I would say that's the single biggest change that I've seen in the NASBA organization, is the ability to serve on organizations above and beyond NASBA. We've done a tremendous job of getting people on outside organizations, whether that be in the international accounting arena, whether it be in the PCC, as we heard yesterday about our Diane Rubin and Billy Atkinson that are serving there, whether it be on the standing advisory group of the PCOB, as Gaylen has served on, or other organizations. But it takes time to get people in those positions. People have to be known. They have to be seen. People have to see their body of work. They're not willing, those people that run those organizations are not willing to just take somebody because Ken Bishop or Walter Davenport nominated them. They need to have seen that person in action and say, oh yeah, that's a great person. I've seen them at work. I've seen them doing things over here. we would love to have them in XYZ position. And so the third charge of our group is to figure out how to get you all showcased for other organizations. And this is not just board members of NASBA or past chairs of NASBA. Many of you have skills that can be brought to bear on these positions that we have available to us within NASBA. If we don't get the right people in these positions, we're going to lose the opportunity to nominate. So those are the three things that we're charged with. We've developed or started to develop some takeaways to give back to the organization. We haven't finished our work. We'll finish that this year, and we'll report back to our chair, Walter Davenport, who has agreed to continue to the further service of this group. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. Anyone who's worked on getting legislation passed knows how many different points and how problematic it can be. It's not an easy job to keep an eye on what legislation is introduced and how it's progressed. A bill may start out covering one agency, but a slight change in wording can see it become a bill covering more. Keeping an eye on the twists and turns of legislation that may impact state boards and NASBA is NASBA's Director of Governmental and Legislative Affairs, John Johnson. John?
Well, thank you, Walter, for those kind words and for defending me. I would have to admit that anyone who enjoys following elections, and I can tell you it was a late night last night and early morning this morning, studying bill initiatives, reading bills, reading amendments, could be classified as a political geek, so I'll admit to that. But even if you're not a political geek, I think everyone could agree that this has been, I think, a banner week in our nation's capital. I mean, not only have we heard from some outstanding speakers on key initiatives, initiatives having a long-lasting effect on the regulation of the profession, such as those listed on this slide. But for me personally, being here in the city, I think especially during the midterm elections, is particularly meaningful because so much of what happened yesterday will soon have an impact on the public policies over the next 2 years. The question of who and what political parties will control each of our legislative and executive branches of our state governments was decided yesterday, and that is for the most part. There are still votes being tallied today, and there should be some runoff elections in the coming months. But the question of what public policies will emerge should become, I think, a bit clearer as many of our state legislatures begin to convene their reorganization sessions over really the next 30 days, including the important announcements of committee assignments and leadership roles that will be announced, which usually gives those who are really the true political geeks in those jurisdictions, I think, a leg up on the public policy that will be coming and moving forward over the next 2 years. And I think more importantly for us in this room, what effect those policies could have on the regulation of the accounting profession. I think it's also fair to say what happens in this city has a profound effect on public policy decisions made in each of our 55 jurisdictions, as more than 26% of most state budgets come from the federal government. And as those dollars continue to shrink, we will begin to see not only a ripple effect in many of our state budgets, but also perhaps a shift in public policy. In fact, in a recent speech given by Governor Fallin of Oklahoma, who is also the chair of the National Governors Association in response to the federal budget cuts in Washington gridlock, she stated, and I quote, It's left to the states to chart their own path and pursue their own public policies, where partisan gridlock has left Washington unable to address the nation's serious problems. You know, one reason why state legislatures can't afford the luxury of gridlock that the federal government seems to enjoy, and this is besides the fact that states have to balance their budgets each year, is because in more than half of our jurisdictions, citizens are given the power to make and take matters into their own hands. This slide shows you the states in green that allow citizens the opportunity to circumvent the legislative process by placing initiatives directly onto their ballots. And for those of you who reside in one of the other states, I can tell you there's still a strong connection between those initiatives on those states that tell us about the mood of the country and the issues that might end up still in your legislatures. These are the three common ways to get public policy either on the state ballot through circumventing the legislative process, or simply the legislature wants the citizens to decide a particular issue. And you know, one example that's coming very familiar to the profession occurred back in 1996 when California voters passed Proposition 215, which allowed marijuana to be used for medical conditions. And that sounds to us, I think, pretty benign as it relates to the accounting profession. However, 18 years later, 18 states, the District of Columbia, and now yesterday Guam, have all passed laws allowing marijuana for medical reasons. And for those of you who were in practice 18 years ago, or for that matter, probably 5 years ago, I'm sure you never imagined an issue like marijuana becoming a significant policy issue for CPAs doing work for clients in this line of work, as they now wade through the various fiduciary complexities and really the simple fact that this still is a substance under federal law. And it may not surprise for you to see some of the initiatives and referendum ballots throughout the country in yesterday's election. I mean, there were actually 33 citizens initiatives, 97 legislative referendum, and 4 popular referendum. This slide shows you the states that are traditionally heavy users of placing initiatives on ballots. And California leads the way with 88 initiatives over the last 14 years, followed by Oregon with 64, Colorado with 47, Washington State 46, and Arizona had 30 initiatives on ballots since 2000. These were the heavy users on yesterday's ballots. Louisiana actually led the way with 14 ballot measures. Their issues range from taxes, banking, judiciary, and health care, just to name a few. The issue that actually led the way on yesterday's ballot was minimum wage, followed up by bonds and taxes, gambling, and transportation. And although none of the 134 initiatives that were on ballots yesterday had an impact on the regulation of the profession, I can tell you they are a very good indicator of the mood of the public and gives those who study public policy, I think, an insight as to the policies that you will see in your legislatures over the next 2 years. Another important barometer to help us gauge public policy, and I alluded to it a little bit earlier, resides in the economy. For example, in 2012, the fiscal health of state budgets began to finally improve after several years of declining revenue growth. And virtually every general revenue growth became noticeably stronger in 2013. However, despite that improved growth over the last several years, a recent survey done by the National Conference of State Legislatures, also referred to as the NCSL, indicates that lawmakers remain uncertain about the sustainability of these stronger revenue growths as growing Medicaid costs and other federal cuts continue to put pressure on our state budgets. Some of the data released by NCSL shows a fairly significant drop in cash reserves, going from $35.1 billion in 2013 to $16.8 billion projected in 2015. Virginia, for example, was already projecting a modest budget deficit in 2014, but this, however, has now turned into a sizable gap of about $2.4 billion over the next 3 years. And I think as many of our state boards can attest to, whenever there is a lack of cash on hand, legislatures tend to look for the healthy trust funds to balance their budgets and begin the exercise of reducing state government. And both these actions can be dangerous and lead to the consolidation of board functions, which eventually hinder the board's ability to properly regulate the profession. And this is certainly an area that we'll be following very closely in 2015. In addition to public policy issues placed on ballots as well as the economic forecasts, we shouldn't overlook those that we elect to enact laws that we did yesterday. There are 7,383 legislative seats in our country, along with the governors of those jurisdictions, as well as the 535 members of Congress. And these individuals, especially the party in control, and I emphasize that, will influence the policy over the next 2 years. Going into yesterday's election, there were the political parties in control of our state legislatures, of our 50 states, were these. There were 27 controlled by the Republicans, 19 by the Democrats. There were 3 split legislatures and 1 nonpartisan legislature. And these were the 16 states that I've been paying particular attention to, mainly because of their closeness in political control and their history over the years of flipping power back and forth, especially during midterm elections, and potentially altering their approach to public policy as they begin the 2015 legislative sessions. This map shows us the political party control of the gubernatorial races going into yesterday's election. And based on polling that was done actually about 10 days ago, we had Kansas, Wisconsin, Georgia, Florida, Connecticut, and Maine were considered toss-up states. Based on yesterday's results, none of those 6 states actually flipped. However, within the other 30 gubernatorial races, several flipped political control, and this certainly could have an impact in those jurisdictions as we move forward in 2015, not only in public policy, but certainly an impact on the profession. One area of activity that we'll be paying very close attention to in 2015, and this is regardless of the party in control, is the legislation we expect to be filed in response to the recent changes to the Uniform Accountancy Act. And based on those changes, I sent a quick poll to the executive directors of all of our 55 state boards of accountancy about 3 weeks ago, and I asked the question, does your jurisdiction plan on filing legislation to incorporate the new definition of a test? Of the 28 responses I received, 5 indicated that legislation would be filed in 2015. There were no responses for 2016. 2 indicated 2017 or later. 12 said they didn't know, as many of those 12 indicated that their legislative committee was not meeting until after the election. And 3 of our jurisdictions stated they already had the new language in their statute and rules. And for those of you who are not 100% sure if the test has been adopted in your jurisdiction or not, this map was put together by our friends at the CPA State Regulatory and Legislative Affairs Department. Thanks to Matt, Suzanne, and James for this information. But this map shows the jurisdictions in dark blue that already are in compliance with the new definition of the test, which also includes Alabama, Arizona, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, who enacted legislation in 2014. The 2 jurisdictions in light blue have some minor conforming changes in order to be in full compliance, and those that are in red certainly have some more work to do in order to be compatible to the recent changes in the UAA. And if any of those jurisdictions in red are moving forward with the attest legislation in 2015 and certainly would like assistance drafting language or reviewing your language, please do not hesitate to let me know. In that same quick poll, I asked the question, which jurisdictions were planning on filing legislation to incorporate firm mobility? There were no responses for 2015, or 16. 2 jurisdictions indicated 2017 or later. 12 said they didn't know at this time. Once again, many of those 12 indicated that their committees were not meeting until after yesterday's election. And 7 jurisdictions said they already had firmability. And in fact, 14 jurisdictions have already adopted firmability. And here's another map provided by the ASCPA that shows those 14 jurisdictions in dark blue that do not require a firm to register to perform and test services. I know it's hard to see on this map that there is an asterisk next to North Carolina because while they do not require a fee or registration, the North Carolina Board of Examiners does require notice to the board. And finally, within that same quick poll, I asked the question, what other legislation will you anticipate to be filed in 2015? Responses included eliminating two-tier licensing. Another said moving from a triennial to an annual CPA reporting period. Several jurisdictions indicated they were fearful that their trust funds would be swept in 2015. Another said tweaking their firm mobility statute. One said indicated they were going to be cleaning up their peer review statute. And lastly, 2 of the remaining 3 jurisdictions that do not yet have enacted an individual mobility indicated that they would be filing legislation in 2015. And with the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico enacting mobility in 2014, and Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands indicating they would be filing legislation in 2015. And this is not to say that our friends in Hawaii would not be filing legislation in 2015, because I am confident that they will be. I just have not received confirmation yet. But I put this map up not only to show where we stand as it relates to fulfilling our goal of 100% adoption, but really more importantly, as a testament to what the power of collective effort between state boards, state societies, NASBA, the ASCPA, and the profession can accomplish when we speak with one voice in the halls of our capitals. And this same collaboration was carried over in other legislation passed in 2004 in Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Georgia, Wisconsin, and that's just to name a few. You know, although that we just completed the 2014 election cycle, and that's certainly for the most part, this map shows you the states in yellow that are already pre-filing legislation for 2015 legislative sessions. Those that are in green are technically, and they're still in their 2014 legislative session. And Virginia, which is in blue, is in a special session, as I mentioned earlier, working through their budget issues still today. Just a reminder, NASBA makes available online 24/7 all the bills that we were monitoring on behalf of our state boards. All you need to do is go to NASBA's homepage at nasba.org. Click on the Member Center tab at the top of the page. Once you get there, click on Legislative Tracking, and this will take you to our Legislative Tracking homepage. And one way to enter into the system is very simple. Just click on a state that's illuminated in green. That would be an indication to you that there is at least one bill that we have tagged in our system that we're tracking through a particular legislative session. Once you click on that state, the list of bills will come up numerically ordered. All of the bills will have links to the language of the legislation, amendments, and the status of where that bill is in the legislative process. You can also click on any of the 7 predetermined searches at the bottom of the page to view all legislation that has been tagged for a particular subject matter. Or if you just want to look at the high priority pieces of legislation, click on the high priority tag at the top of the page, and this will take you to the legislation that we have tagged that is high priority. This is legislation that either has a direct impact on the regulation of the profession, or it either contains existing language, and if that language to be amended through the process could have an impact on the county profession. And in closing, you know, while NASBA's legislative tracking system now gives us the ability to identify and proactively remove roadblocks before they become law. It's my hope there's even a larger outcome. First is greater unity among our boards. By sharing information on legislation, certainly we can learn from each other's experiences. It's very important. And finally, I think greater dialogue, collaboration will continue to emerge between our state boards, NASBA, state societies, the AICPA, on important issues of the profession. And I look forward to working with each of you on these and other important goals in 2015. Thank you.
Thank you, John. At this time, I'd like to call past Chair Gaylen Hansen, who will talk to us about the Standard Setting Study Group. Gaylen?
Thank you, Walter. If I can get my slides coming up here. So, and thank you, Sam, for setting the tone for us this morning. What a great story that was, and in Washington, D.C., particularly, and right after this election, and then, of course, John filling us in on the legislative impacts that filter all the way down to state boards. So my particular segment here this morning is to do a bit of a report back on a matter that came up over the last several years. Actually, it probably goes back further than that, and that is to really look into the rightful role of state boards in the aspect of setting standards that impact the entire profession. And so during my term as chair, a standards study group was established, and my purpose here this morning is to get back to you because we promised that we would do that, and that's something that we discussed at the regional meetings. This study group was established to look at, as I said, to look into the background of standards, how they filter into the profession, and what our role should be. And so there was a couple value propositions that was put forth on the screen there for the public and the accounting profession to have confidence in those standards, the manner in which they're developed, monitored, and revised. And that we feel is crucial enough that state boards should be involved. To what extent was the purpose of the study group? Another value proposition is that we believe that process should be fair, equitable, and free of bias to ensure that public confidence is underscored and that the protection of the public is represented in the development of those standards. So those are a couple of the concepts. And we spent a great deal of time last year putting together what best practices are within the various standard-setting bodies, some of which have a government root, others which are established in connection with various associations like the AICPA and its independent standard boards, others in the international realm. Our standard study group charge is set out here. It was to discuss and provide recommendations then to the NASBA Board of Directors regarding considerations for NASBA's strategy and position with respect to representing boards of accountancy in standard setting for all entities other than public entities. Why? That's because the SEC and the PCAOB by law handle those. Also to address various boards of accountancy's options as to the depth and breadth of their involvement in establishing standards. So the study group was put together. I was asked to chair it by myself, and then later Carlos Johnson when he took over the chairmanship last year. It was a small group, members of the NASBA Board of Directors, Donnie Burkett, Walter Davenport, Ray Johnson, Harry Parsons, and Lori Tisch. We met together face-to-face on 3 different occasions. We had some conference calls. We presented our recommendations to the boards of accountancy during the regional meetings earlier this year, and had a great dialogue and discussion with them, and the final recommendations then went to the NASBA Board of Directors in July. And with that, our working group has now completed its charge and will come to an end. And a new committee formed by Chair Davenport. We spent a lot of time talking about what this new committee should be named, and we, after a lot of debate, came to the rather vanilla title, Standard Setting Advisory Committee. So this will be a committee then that has been appointed by Chairman Davenport, and its charge was recommended to him, which I believe he has now adopted: monitor and objectively evaluate processes of standard setters on behalf of boards of accountancy, recommending improvements when warranted, and then proactively advise boards of accountancy and NASBA leadership regarding these activities. Now, specifically, there were three other recommendations that I would like to go over with you. And it is to really increase our efforts at NASBA to keep boards, you folks, apprised of standard setting activities and any concerns that the committee notes in the monitoring process. In other words, we don't want you to be surprised by anything. We've had occasions when that has happened, and this is to avoid those sorts of situations. It's secondly, to increase technical staff support of appointees to external boards and committees. Sam talked a little bit about those committees. I've served on some of them, and it's interesting when you're serving on something like the Peak, and these are very, very high-powered groups that you're involved in, and they have a lot of technical support. The members of those committees are highly prepared when they come to them. They frequently have support from their firms. And when you're from NASBA, in the past, it's kind of been you're sort of out there on your own, and you just can't believe the amount of reading and preparation that it takes. And Ken Bishop talked a little bit about it yesterday, but we're looking to really increase the ability to support our appointees to these committees with technical support so that they're prepared. And in connection with that, we are going to have periodic meetings of these groups. We've already done that with our appointees to the Auditing Standards Board. We had 2 conference calls. This morning we actually met with some of the NASBA representatives on the Peak. And there's nothing surreptitious about this. It's just to make sure that people are aware of the issues, especially as it relates to the state regulatory perspective. And so that when somebody asks at these meetings, well, how does NASBA feel about this? Or how will this be regarded by state boards or accepted by them? That we'll have the ability to respond and say, well, this is NASBA's view, or this is the state board's view generally. We can't speak for each one of the states. That's not the point of this. But the point is that to try to make us a better organized and better part of this process, and from the standard setter, so that they're not surprised as to how we feel about things either, so that we can reconcile and reduce friction as we go through this process. And then the third bullet there, continue to actively solicit well-qualified qualified nominees for positions on standard setting bodies. And Sam also spoke to that. Yeah, we really aren't just putting names forward for the sake of filling seats, but really to make a difference in this process. And so this is what we did last year and part of the year before in response to that question, what should our role be? And Are we ready to start? I think you're going to invite questions to all three of us, right?
Gaylen, thank you. Well, you've heard from Gaylen. You've heard from Gaylen, Sam, and John with the updates from the selected committees. So here's your opportunity to ask them questions regarding what their committees are doing or how their committees could help what you're doing. So are there any questions of these three individuals? Sam, I do have one question for you, Sam.
Okay.
Sam?
Go ahead.
Okay. How long is your committee thinking it takes to develop leadership in NASBA through this group?
If your question is, what's the gestation period for a leader? It certainly starts before they join NASBA or a state board. And then during the period of time that they have the opportunity to be associated with NASBA, it's important that we identify. So for example, in Idaho, our board members serve for 5 years. I know there are other boards where a person might be on for a much longer period of time, but we have a very short window as NASBA in that 5-year period of time to identify a Idaho board member, get them in the right positions, make sure they're interested, make sure we pique their interest and give them opportunities to be interested, and then move them along through the organization. So I don't think there's a beginning or ending period to it. I suppose the ending period is when they leave their board and leave any participation with NASBA.
Good. Thanks.
Walter, I have a question.
Okay.
I'll ask myself.
Okay. Gaylen, you got a question for Gaylen?
Yeah, I do. I have a question for Gaylen. So is this Standards Advisory Committee, how does it interact with the Regulatory Response Committee? The Regulatory Response Committee is the voice for NASBA as far as comment letters that go out. Now, does it speak on its own? No. It drafts those letters, and usually those goes through whatever committee, whether it be ethics or some of the other committees, CPE, whatever, peer review. And then it's reviewed by and actually signed by the chair and the CEO of the organization, so it's well vetted. The purpose of this committee is not to replace or overlap with the Regulatory Response Committee.
Okay, good.
So
Okay.
the reason I asked that question of myself is we were asked that a number of times, and I wanted to reinforce it with this group.
Okay, thank you. John, do you have a question for John?
You're going to feel left out. You can ask your own question.
Now, John, based on the results of yesterday and what's going to happen in 2015, the next opportunity for things to change is going to be 2016. Do you have any thoughts as to what's going to happen then or how that can affect state boards and their legislation?
Sure. Well, I can tell you right now that I've already gotten emails from those who already were elected yesterday asking for contributions for 2016. That is the process. It is, especially when you're dealing with people, and especially 2-year terms in their House of Representatives, they are constantly in the process of really collecting money, trying to fight off challenges in 2016. I think it really depends on if you're coming from a state that has term limits versus one that does not have term limits. And so really it's a matter of really looking at those demographics, especially those that have term limits, to see where the holes are as far as the number of seats are being turned over. They'll have really an impact really within those jurisdictions. I mean, really, not until, 2022, when we, redraw our districts, will we see, I think, any major changes as far as the parties in control. And at the end of the day, it's not really the individual who's elected. It's really the party who is controlling these individuals. I mean, you could literally probably take the Republican Party, the Democrat Party, and just have one vote. I mean, as you get down into the nitty-gritty, if it's a budget issue or if it's a regulatory issue, they are very forceful in telling their folks on how to move forward. So,
Okay, good. Gaylen?
Walter, since I'm in a question-asking mood, I'll ask John a question. So, John, as a result of the election that just took place, and I don't know whether this is on point or not, but consolidation, do you see the direction shifting? We have had a trend with consolidation. Is that going to continue with this, or will there be a backup as a result of the face of Congress changing and maybe less of an emphasis on regulation?
well, I mean, as far as the Congress and the gridlock, I mean, I don't see that changing anytime soon, and certainly there's lots of the budget issues that carry down to our states. As I said, 26% of state budget dollars come from the federal government, and some of the issues we're seeing in Virginia, I mean, as those dollars dwindle, it is putting pressure on those states to either raise taxes or to make other cuts within their states, and so those are the tough decisions that need to be made. I think when you look at consolidation, I think it's an issue that should be on the table for boards of accountancy, for departments each and every year, no matter how flush their budgets are or in difficult times. Because really, if it's a matter of, it's either making cuts because they have to, because they need to save money, or it's an election a year down the road, and somebody in the legislature wants to show that they are fiscally responsible with their dollars, regardless of how much money's in their budgets or what the surplus is. So I think it's an issue it's always on the table. I think it will be on the table, and I think as a profession, as we work together, I mean, this is an issue that really is discussion with the State Society Relations Committee that we have, and certainly working with our friends in our state societies, and trying to really emphasize the important point that you're as fast as your slowest man. And if you have a board that is not properly funded, is not able to properly regulate the profession, it is a black eye in the profession in that state, from top to bottom. And that's something we need to, I think, work on and emphasize with everybody.
John, Gaylen, Sam, thank you very much.